There is a body of water so strategically critical that the entire architecture of modern civilization bends around it. Not a sea, not an ocean, a strait. 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. And right now, something is shifting there in ways that most people, including most analysts, have not fully processed. Welcome to Nexa World Brief, where we don't chase headlines. We chase the forces that create them. Because what is unfolding near the Strait of Hormuz today is not simply a military standoff or a diplomatic dispute. It is a stress test of the entire global energy system. And if that system cracks even slightly, the reverberations will arrive in places you never expected. In your grocery bill, in your mortgage rate, in the price tag on the shelf of a store, in a country that has never once heard the name of this waterway pronounced out loud. Let's start with a number that deserves more attention than it gets. 20%. That is the fraction of the entire world's petroleum supply that moves through a single narrow maritime corridor on any given day. Not 20% of one region's oil. 20% of the world's. Every super tanker threading through that passage, every barrel of crude bound for refineries in Japan, South Korea, China, India, and Western Europe, all of it moves through a geographic bottleneck so constrained that in some sections, tankers traveling in opposite directions are almost within shouting distance of one another. And here is the part that makes this genuinely terrifying rather than merely interesting. There is no backup. There is no parallel infrastructure standing ready to absorb that volume if the strait becomes impassable. The pipelines that exist in the region move a fraction of the flow. The alternative routes add weeks of transit time, astronomical additional costs, and still cannot handle the full volume. This is not a vulnerability that can be engineered away over a weekend. It is baked into the physical geography of the Earth itself. Now here is where the story gets complicated. Because the nation that sits along the northern shore of that waterway has spent the better part of 4 decades thinking very carefully about exactly this vulnerability. Not its own vulnerability, yours. Iran's military planners, specifically the commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, understood something fundamental early on. A conventional arms race against the United States Navy was not a contest they could win. The Americans had aircraft carriers, precision munitions, satellite surveillance, and global force projection capability on a scale that no mid-sized regional power could realistically match. So instead of trying to win on those terms, Iran built something entirely different. Something that didn't try to defeat American naval power directly, but instead tried to make the cost of using that power prohibitively high. What emerged from that strategic logic is what military analysts call an asymmetric naval doctrine. And it is, depending on how you look at it, either a masterpiece of defensive ingenuity or a fragile system built on a single assumption that, if broken, collapses the entire structure. The IRGC Navy dispersed itself. Rather than concentrating its forces into large, visible fleets, it scattered fast-moving attack boats, shore-based missile launchers, drone platforms, and underwater mine-laying assets across a dense network of coastal positions, hidden inlets, and small island outposts. The idea was not to overpower an adversary, but to saturate their decision-making with so many simultaneous, unpredictable threats that any military commander trying to plan a clean, decisive engagement would be looking at a risk calculation that simply didn't add up favorably. This is the doctrine of making yourself so expensive to fight that fighting you stops being rational. And for a long time it worked. It generated exactly the deterrence effect it was designed to generate. But here is the twist in this story that almost nobody is talking about loudly enough. That entire doctrine, every element of it, every carefully hidden position, every dispersed asset, every camouflage staging site rests on a single foundational condition. The enemy must not know where you are. Concealment is not a tactical advantage within this system. It is the system. Remove it and the whole architecture becomes not just weakened but structurally inverted. A force designed to strike from hidden positions that no longer has hidden positions is no longer an asymmetric threat. It is simply an outgunned military waiting to be dismantled. And this is precisely where certain recent reports, not yet fully confirmed by the major international news wires, but circulating with enough consistency to demand analytical attention, become deeply significant. There are credible suggestions that some form of confrontation occurred in the waters near the Strait of Hormuz in early May 2026. The details remain contested. But the strategic question that those reports raise does not depend on the details to be valid. Because if any engagement occurred, regardless of its scale or outcome, the act of engagement itself carries a consequence that no military communique will acknowledge directly. When a concealed force responds to provocation, it reveals itself. Every missile battery that fires gives away its coordinates. Every fast attack boat that scrambles from a hidden harbor marks that harbor on an intelligence map. Every drone platform that activates its launch sequence generates electronic signatures that can be traced, recorded, and acted upon in real time. This is the brutal physics of asymmetric warfare that analysts have been writing about for years, but that tends to get lost when coverage focuses on the immediate drama of the confrontation rather than its structural aftermath. The act of fighting back is simultaneously the act of becoming visible. And once you are visible, the foundational logic of your entire deterrence strategy has been invalidated. There is a counter-argument that demands to be heard here because intellectual honesty requires it. Some of the most respected strategic analysts in the field, scholars at institutions that have spent decades studying Persian Gulf dynamics, argue forcefully that any scenario involving deliberate escalation near the strait carries risks that no party can fully control in advance. History is not short of examples of military confrontations that began with one side believing it had precisely calibrated the level of response it would trigger and ended with outcomes that nobody sitting in any planning room had modeled. Escalation has a momentum of its own. It feeds on incomplete information, on domestic political pressures that override strategic rationality, on institutional actors within governments whose personal and organizational interests are served by conflict continuing rather than resolving. When you factor in all of those variables, the idea that any actor can engineer a contained, surgically limited engagement in one of the most geopolitically sensitive waterways on Earth and then confidently predict where it stops is not a strategy. It is an assumption masquerading as one. And this is where the analysis has to move inward into the internal architecture of power inside Iran itself. Because to understand what happens next near the strait, you cannot simply analyze it as a bilateral confrontation between Tehran and Washington. You have to understand the profound structural tensions within the Iranian state between the institutions that formally hold authority and the institutions that operationally exercise it. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is not a military branch in the conventional sense. It is simultaneously an armed force, a vast economic conglomerate with investments across construction, telecommunications, energy, and trade, and a deeply embedded political constituency with its own ideological identity and its own institutional survival imperatives. Its incentive structure is not identical to the incentive structure of Iran's diplomatic apparatus or its civilian government. The IRGC does not benefit from a normalized Iran integrated into global trade and international institutions the way a functioning civilian government would. Its power, its economic position, its institutional relevance, all of it is maximized in a state of managed confrontation, not resolution. This is not conspiracy thinking. It is organizational analysis. Institutions act in their institutional interests. And the historical record, covering multiple cycles of Iranian nuclear negotiations going back more than 2 decades, shows a remarkably consistent pattern. Periods when Iranian diplomats were closest to reaching workable agreements with Western counterparts were reliably accompanied by episodes of IRGC activity that complicated, delayed, or ultimately derailed those openings. Not because a shadowy council ordered specific operations to occur at specific moments of diplomatic sensitivity, but because when an organization's survival is threatened by a particular outcome, that organization tends to generate actions that prevent the outcome, often without anyone explicitly ordering it to do so. This is how powerful institutions protect themselves. And it is one of the most important and least discussed dynamics in the current situation. Before we move forward, we have to address the dimension of this story that connects most directly to your life and the lives of billions of people who will never follow geopolitical analysis and have no idea where the Strait of Hormuz is on a map. The economic transmission mechanism, because what happens in that narrow waterway does not stay in that waterway. It travels with speed and mechanical certainty. It moves through the entire architecture of global commerce until it arrives somewhere deeply personal. Oil markets do not wait for supply to actually be disrupted before they react. They price in the probability of disruption. They price in the risk. which means that every moment of credible tension, every unverified report of a confrontation, every diplomatic statement that falls short of de-escalation is already being processed by trading floors in London and Singapore and Chicago in real time. Previous periods of serious Hormuz tension produced oil price spikes measured not in weeks but in days, sometimes hours. And those spikes do not stay on commodity trading screens. A significant rise in global crude prices sends ripple effects into maritime freight rates almost immediately. And freight rates are not an abstraction. They determine how much it costs to move a container of manufactured goods from a factory in Vietnam to a port in Rotterdam. They determine the landed cost of electronics assembled in Malaysia, of textiles produced in Bangladesh, of agricultural machinery shipped from South Korea. Every supply chain on Earth that moves goods by sea, which is most of them, is exposed to this transmission. But the chain doesn't stop at manufactured goods. The connection to food prices is direct and underappreciated. Agricultural production across large parts of the world depends on petrochemical inputs, fertilizers whose production costs are tightly linked to energy prices. When energy prices spike, fertilizer costs follow. When fertilizer costs rise, they embed themselves into the cost of growing food, and that embedding persists across multiple growing seasons. The inflation that arrives in food prices from an energy shock in the Persian Gulf is not a short-term pulse. It is a structural shift that can take years to work its way out of the system. Now overlay this economic reality onto the specific situation facing economies that are deeply integrated into global trade and highly dependent on imported energy. Countries across South and Southeast Asia, across East Africa, across parts of Latin America, these are not abstract geopolitical players in this story. They are the end nodes of a global supply chain whose fundamental input, energy, is determined by decisions made by institutional actors thousands of kilometers away. Their populations experience the consequences of those decisions without having any meaningful influence over them. This is the silent geography of global economic power. Not armies, not missiles, infrastructure, supply routes. The physical architecture of how energy moves from where it is extracted to where it is consumed. Before any military doctrine, before any political negotiation, that infrastructure is the most consequential force in the world today. And right now, it is under more visible stress than it has been at any point in recent memory. Here is the layer that sits beneath even the economics, the part of this story that should make anyone watching genuinely uncomfortable. The economic pressure currently being applied to Iran through sanctions is real. It is severe. The Iranian currency has lost extraordinary purchasing power over a sustained period. Ordinary Iranian citizens are experiencing the grinding daily reality of an economy under sustained external pressure. But there is a pattern in how economies under sanctions actually behave that contradicts the intuitive logic of why sanctions are applied. The assumption behind sanctions as a policy tool is that economic pain will either motivate a government to change its behavior or weaken it to the point where it cannot sustain its current course. The historical evidence across Iran's own experience in multiple sanctions cycles and across comparable cases in other contexts tells a more complicated story. Economic compression under sanctions does not distribute its pressure evenly across a society. The actors who are most capable of surviving and even thriving in a closed, pressurized, sanctions-adapted economy are precisely the actors who have built parallel economic systems, black market access, informal trade networks, and institutional control over the sectors that remain functional regardless of international pressure, which in Iran's case means the IRGC and its affiliated economic networks. Economic pressure, rather than weakening the institution most resistant to diplomatic compromise, may actually strengthen it relative to the civilian and moderate voices within the Iranian system who depend on international economic integration to remain relevant. If this pattern holds, and the historical data suggests it does, then the strategic logic of the current pressure campaign contains a profound irony. The tool being used to change the behavior of the most resistant actors may be the same tool that ensures those actors become more dominant. This is where the analysis arrives at an honest and deeply uncomfortable place. There is no clean resolution visible from here. The military dynamics create deterrence logic that pushes both sides toward hardened positions. The internal politics of both Tehran and Washington constrain the flexibility of the actors who might otherwise find compromise workable. The economic stakes for the global system are so enormous that any serious disruption would generate pressures that cascade far beyond the immediate parties. And the institutional structures on both sides contain powerful actors whose interests are not served by resolution. When all of those forces operate simultaneously and in the same direction, the question is no longer whether a solution exists in theory. The question becomes which structural force gives way first, and what giving way actually costs the institution that does it. Because in a system built on deterrence and reputation, the first party to step back from a confrontation doesn't just lose a tactical position. It potentially loses the credibility that its entire strategic posture depends on. What comes next at the Strait of Hormuz will not be decided by diplomats in conference rooms or by military commanders in operations centers, at least not in isolation. It will be decided by the interaction of all of these forces simultaneously. The military doctrine built on concealment that may have already been partially exposed, the internal IRGC institutional dynamics that resist resolution, the economic pressures that counterintuitively empower the most resistant actors, and the global market systems that are already pricing in risk before any definitive outcome has occurred. The signals that matter are already moving. The data is already shifting. The infrastructure of the global energy system is already adjusting in anticipation of outcomes that haven't happened yet. That is how these situations actually work. Not with a single dramatic moment, but with a gradual structural repositioning that is invisible until suddenly it isn't. The question that this moment leaves genuinely unresolved, and it deserves to stay unresolved because false certainty would be worse than honest uncertainty, is this. When two institutional systems are simultaneously trapped by their own internal logic, each incapable of visible retreat without catastrophic political cost, and the waterway between them carries 20% of the world's energy supply. What exactly does a stable outcome look like? And perhaps more urgently, who on either side is even empowered to build one? Keep watching Nexa World Brief, because the answers will not come from the headlines. They will come from the signals, and we will be watching all of them.